And salute to you all for you've made it to session 4 of the 2-day meeting, and appreciate having you all here. My name is Matt Zahn. I am the Deputy Health Officer for the Orange County Healthcare Agency in Southern California. I'm also a pediatric infectious disease physician, and I represent the Infectious Disease Society of America on the forum, and really have always enjoyed the conversation. As a member of the Planning Committee, it is my pleasure to introduce session 4, entitled Sustainment, Critical Aspects of Leadership and Support. The first part of this session will be a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Dr. Zeke Emanuel, who I believe is joining us online. I believe so. And the focus of this is it? I know. I'm hearing it too. Sounds better. Okay. The focus of this session is going to be the efforts that were made to coordinate the research response to the COVID event, but also to monkeypox. And part of this panel discussion, also an emphasis will be for what has gone right in coordination of that event and how do we sustain those efforts over time, excuse me. And also how going forward in coordinating these research response, how do you assure equity both in persons who are participating in these research studies and how you go about assuring that the work that comes out of these research studies are equitably available to the community and to the country and to the world. A note or introduction to Dr. Emanuel. Zeke is currently the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives at the University of Pennsylvania. He is an oncologist and he is a world leader in health policy and bioethics. Among many other positions and achievements, he is a special advisor to the Director General of the WHO. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is also the founding chair of the Department of Bioethics at the NIH. So Zeke, welcome, and we appreciate you having, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here, and I apologize for not being in person. COVID has intervened. I got it yesterday, so I hope that this hybrid model is less than optimal, but we will make do, and I hope that we can get out of it what we need. We're going to begin with 3 presentations. Then I am going to make a few thoughts on our situation regarding clinical research going forward. And then we will take questions and have a discussion with the audience. Is Nahid Bedelia here? Is she?
She is.
I don't have a full list. So, yes, no, maybe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm here, Zeke.
Oh, I can't. Sorry, I can't see you. Nahid is the senior policy advisor to the White House COVID response team, who I happened to talk to just yesterday, is going to. She did a 1-year evaluation of the pandemic preparedness plan, and is going to speak to us about her thoughts on the clinical research efforts during this pandemic and what it might portend for the future.
Great. So jumping right in, I think just to step back and say before I am anything else, I am an infectious diseases physician and a biomedical researcher. So for me, this is really quite personal because it has been our reality for not just this pandemic, but many other prior pandemics in terms of how we respond to biological threats. I'm going to start by just saying that from a government perspective, when one thinks about the role of a federal government or central government in organizing for the research response, what's critically important is that we start that thinking well before a pandemic or a biological threat acts. And because the kind of investments that are needed require multi-year in terms of a timeline to actually bear fruit when the crisis actually occurs. And for that, what is required is a vision and a set of priority setting that is outlined, that is commonly understood across agencies, and then it creates a vision that is available to all parts of the private sector, to researchers and academics elsewhere. And for us currently, I mean, I know that Gary's going to talk a little bit more about the COVID experience because he was in government for that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more forward facing, which is that, as you may know, in September of this year, that vision, that strategy of how the U.S. is thinking about the future pandemic preparedness was expressed in the National Biodefense Strategy, which was updated from the 2018. And critical reasons for that, the critical reason for putting that out is that it is the U.S. government's ability to sort of optimize its own efforts, harness the work of essential partners inside and outside the government, domestically and internationally, to assess, prevent, prepare, respond to, and recover from biological events, whether they're naturally occurring, accidental, or deliberate, that can cause the American people or the global community harm. And within that is not just a set of goals that we want to achieve with our capabilities and our investments, but there's also an implementation plan that outlines, what type of ready response do we need now? What type of partnerships we need to put into place currently? And also research priorities. And as we go through the rest of the discussion, I think some of this will come up. Second to that, there's another document that about a year ago was spearheaded by our partners in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, but it was, again, an interagency process, which is the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan. It's a bit more specific, and it outlines research priorities and biomedical priorities in terms of investments that are necessary. So what Zeke was speaking to, the annual assessment that Dr. Matt Hepburn and I did in September of this year. God, it almost feels like it's been a year since then. Again, we set these priorities a year ago. This was during this administration. Where did these partnerships, investments, and priority settings from last year, where did they bear fruit? What was successful? What are gaps where additional work may be needed, both internally to the government as well as facing outside, where additional investments are required? And that I think is an important part of one of the ways that we can start thinking about the future, is taking the partnerships and investments that work. The other thing that I sort of want to put out there as part of the startup of a conversation is that pandemic plans only go so far when there is no attached funding to them. And as we know, our NSC colleagues have put a request out to support the National Biodefense Strategy with additional investments as a congressional ask for funding as well, which we're still waiting on. And then last 2 points to make. When we think about investments, we often think about the beginning of outbreaks and pandemics. We don't concentrate enough at the ends of pandemics and epidemics. The recovery period, in some ways, is a lot more complicated, and we're in that now. We talk about research investments to study pathogens when they strike us. We don't think about look at the consequences we're seeing currently, right? The rise in RSV cases, influenza cases, the new biological threats from endemic diseases as sort of patterns of disease have changed. And that's also important because when you step back and look at just general impact of epidemics. There was an IMF study, I think, in the fall of 2020 that talked about the fact that the Gini coefficient, the measure of income inequality, increases in the 5 years after every outbreak that occurs, when they looked at the major sort of H1N1 and Ebola, West African Ebola virus disease outbreak that occurred. And if that's the case, you're sort of also seeing a greater societal impact. And what does that mean in terms of us as a biomedical society or community investing in understanding the new health threats that may arise from that? And then the last thing is the biggest takeaway here is also that government cannot be the only single actor in responding. We play an important part in that coordination, in figuring out the kinks. Huge part of this comes as all of us as a community acting on this preparedness at the very beginning, but also a continual exchange during a fast-moving biological incident to respond. And then one of the reasons I think it can't just be government is that every government, every health system has its own unique areas of advantages as well as challenges, right? And for us, I think one of the big things that we've discovered during the pandemic is that when we speak about things like the UK recovery study or the other sort of big efforts that were handled at the national level, we've done a great job here with the work that NIH has done with the ACT and the active trials, but we are inherently different public health systems and healthcare systems. And whereas, our public health system is in the public sector, our healthcare system is in the private sector, and that requires ensuring that those partnerships exist. And that's another reason why it can't just be the government alone. And then beyond that, the government itself, for us, we are a federated republic with democratic ideals. Our plans are made at state level and coordinated at the federal level. And so there's also, again, another partnership that needs to exist beyond the federal government that's ongoing between states, territories, and the federal government that happens before, during, and after a pandemic. So I'll end there.
Great. Thank you very much for that presentation. Next, we have Dimitri Dalaskalkis from the Deputy Coordinator for MPOX, also at the White House, to talk to us about how COVID and MPOX, the COVID pandemic experience maybe influenced MPOX and what we might additionally learn from MPOX.
Thank you very much. So it's great to be here. So I'm not there in person because of a combination of recovery from the flu, so not COVID, and then also just crazy scheduling. So nice to see Naheed from afar. And thank you for having me. So next slide, please. So I'll just go right into it and say that I want to start out about the lessons from COVID and really the lessons from any outbreak, whether it's pandemic sized or if it's significantly smaller. And that's really, there's a successful formula that seems to work every time to address what happens when there's an outbreak of whatever scale. The three ingredients or the three components to that formula tend to be good science, community engagement, and political will. So I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the science that was so important in moving forward the MPOX response. That had to do with moving testing quickly, so not only having tests developed, but also moving tests into the commercial space as quickly as possible so that we could do testing at a larger scale. Using science that we had around vaccine, even though it was not perfect, to make decisions that were necessary in an emergency response to make sure we move forward efforts to vaccinate as many of the at-risk population as possible. And then finally, in the scientific realm, identifying the questions that we have that needed to be answered in real or near real time. And part of that also has to do with transparency. So I think one of the important lessons in MPOX was included putting up a roster of all of the U.S. government-supported research in real time while the outbreak was still happening. Now, community engagement is the second ingredient to that formula. And this, I think, is an example of what a truly community-driven response can look like. So as we've experienced with HIV and so many other outbreaks, nothing about us without us at the table is a mantra that continues to resonate both in HIV as well as in this outbreak. And so critically, having the community at the table, even during times when it was uncomfortable because the response speed was not what they were expecting, was critical in being able to make sure that we moved forward. And that leads into the third ingredient, which is political will. And I think demonstrated by an administration that really tried to mobilize as many efforts as possible, including our coordination team at the White House, to make sure that we were being exquisitely responsive to the needs of communities that were overrepresented in the outbreak by really focusing on the science and really clear and consistent engagement. Next slide, please. I'll give you a brief situation update of where we've been and where we are. So we are over 29,000 cases in the United States. So this map will show you the darker states and jurisdictions represent places with a higher number of cases. Next slide. But there is significant progress. And so this epidemic curve will show you that we have actually achieved a 97% reduction in the number of cases on a rolling daily average than we had at the peak of the outbreak toward the end of July, beginning of August. I'll tell you, it's important to note that the progress that we are making is not necessarily consistent across all populations. Next slide, please. Although we are seeing reductions in cases, the story remains the same. It is a phenomenon that we're seeing mainly in cisgender men who have sex with men. So 95.5% of the cases are cisgender men. We are also seeing cases in women. Just under 3% of the cases are in women. Trans men represent 0.3%, trans women about 0.8%, and then people of other gender identities just under 1% as well. Looking at the age distribution again, you can see that the belly of our curve is around that 31 to 35 years of age. Again, mainly cisgender MSM. Next slide, please. Now, we do see a concentration of the outbreak in Black and Brown communities. So as you can see over time, the demographics have settled and have become pretty much focused on around 50% of cases being among Black and Latino individuals. Again, with that said, we are driving towards zero. In fact, I'll tell you that we've had our couple of first days of 0 cases reported in the United States. But when we were looking at the numbers, we still see too many cases being reported among Black and Brown individuals. Next slide, please. And that really leads us to some areas of success. So again, using science, we were able to work closely across US government to identify ways that we could expand our vaccine supply. I know Gary is there, and Gary can talk a lot more about sort of the effort to increase production as well as fill and finish in the US, but also using data that pushed us more toward an intradermal dosing strategy as opposed to subcutaneous, expanded our vaccine supply by around 4-fold. Based on the fact that one vaccine vial could then go for several doses. We were able to do over 1 million doses, but you can see that we have a softening in demand, both for first and second doses. So first doses being the dark blue bars and the lighter blue bars representing second doses. Next slide, please. Embedded in there is also a clear inequity. As I told you, that the majority of cases, over 50%, are occurring in Black and Brown individuals. The numbers do not equal with the numbers of vaccines that are going in Black and Brown arms. So though we are seeing progress, about 23% of vaccines are going into Latino arms and 13% in Black, and that is an improvement from the beginning of the outbreak. We have not really hit that equity moment where we're actually seeing the right number of vaccines going in relative to a burden of disease in populations. Next slide, please. And so I really want to step back and talk a little bit about sustainment in a different way, which is the pattern of the Mpox outbreak response and how it really does harmonize so well with what Nahid is going to be talking about in terms of the a strategy to address future pandemics, but also I think illustrates a very important lesson, which is that investments in the chronic infectious disease programs that exist today are also investments in acute infectious disease response in the future. Next slide, please. One of the findings that we saw in Mpox is that, not surprisingly, Mpox is not a virus that exists in isolation. 38% of individuals diagnosed with Mpox were also diagnosed with HIV. 41% of them had a prior diagnosis of a sexually transmitted infection in the year prior to their Mpox diagnosis. All comers, 61% either had a known HIV diagnosis or a prior STI diagnosis in the year prior to their Mpox diagnosis. So again, not a disease that's taken in isolation. In fact, when you look at this carefully, it really is interacting epidemics that are facilitated by social determinants of health. And so when we think of those, that's a syndemic. So when you have these interacting epidemics that are worsened or magnified by social determinants of health, that's a syndemic that you've observed and requires a syndemic-based strategy to respond. Next slide, please. Here's just some more supporting evidence that Mpox exists in a syndemic. And I'll give the example of the syndemic with HIV. So people with Mpox and HIV infection were more likely to report many more of the severe symptoms of Mpox. When you look at individuals for whom we had information on hospitalization, people living with HIV were more likely to be hospitalized than those without. That's 8% versus 3%. But the story gets deeper when you look at individuals with poorly controlled HIV. So individuals who had a detectable viral load experienced more severe symptoms, but were also 3 times more likely to be hospitalized than all people with HIV and 9 times more likely to be hospitalized than those without HIV. Individuals with more immunocompromised systems based on a T cell count less than 350 were also significantly more likely to be hospitalized. Next slide, please. And then we got more news in October with an MMWR that the CDC published that really told the story of the most severe cases of Mpox in the United States. And what we saw was that 82% of the cases, there were 57 that CDC was consulted on, 82% had HIV. For those of you who follow HIV, the following numbers should be blood chilling. So 72% of the individuals with severe outcomes of Mpox had CD4 counts less than 50. So that really is a throwback to the 90s, a number that I'm not familiar with seeing in any opportunistic infection anymore, given the rarity. Less than 9% of the individuals with severe outcomes of Mpox and HIV were on antiretroviral therapy. The national estimate is that around 65% of people are on meds. So this is very, very low. 68% were Black and 23% were homeless, really bringing home the point that a syndemic exists and is worsened by social determinants of health. Next slide, please. So a syndemic problem requires a syndemic response, and I think that also rings true from the perspective of preparedness, but also the perspective of seeking knowledge from the perspective of research. Many agencies demonstrated the ability to create flexible strategies of support, both for their staffing as well as their funds, that really allowed us to weave together an effective response to Mpox. Ryan White, through HRSA, was able to create flexibilities. CDC, through its HIV and STD funding, allowed for the use of those funds to address the Mpox outbreak. SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health organization at HRSA, created flexibilities to allow their funding to be used to navigate individuals both either treatment, testing, or vaccine. Next slide, please. And also our housing authority was able to use housing resources to assist individuals with housing needs if they were affected by Mpox, including those living with HIV, such a critical point given the finding of the individuals with severe cases through HOPWA, or the Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS program over at HUD. Next slide, please. So I'll say, the community engagement here has been so critical. And from the very beginning, being told that the name of Mpox, its former name, monkeypox, really generated stigma and barriers. I think the recent sort of shift that happened at the WHO just really shows you what is needed in order for a response to be effective. And I again go back to my formula that it requires science, and science that you're willing to say what you know and don't know in real time, even if if you have to make decisions based on an emergency. But then also that engagement and that ongoing engagement to address barriers and stigma so that we can keep the science going over the finish line. And then finally, that political will ends up being so important. And again, coming to this administration to be able to help here and being told to make sure that the response focuses on the populations of gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, and those Black and brown individuals in the LGBTQ community really allowed us to propel the work. And again, when those three elements of the formula come together, you can see what happens to an epidemic curve over time with cases driving down towards zero. Next slide, please. Thank you very much, and I'll give it back to our moderator. Thanks, Ezekiel.
Thank you so much for that presentation, and also to some degree, at least for some of us like me, an update on how low the MPOX cases have gone as of yesterday. And our final panelist is Gary Disbrow, who's the director of BARDA, to talk about their perspective and investments in pandemic preparedness and research related to pandemic preparedness.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and provide perspectives from the BARDA organization. So if I could have the first slide. This is going to be a wave-top briefing because I know we have limited time, but I did want to touch on multiple aspects. So BARDA was established under the Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act, and many people are still not aware of the BARDA organization, but our mandate and our mission is to develop vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices to protect the U.S. In the event of chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear threats and pandemic influenza. We also have, sorry about that, we also have a mandate and a charge, thank you, for addressing emerging infectious diseases, but we don't receive annual appropriations to support a program for emerging infectious diseases. We have that for our CBRN programs as well as our pandemic influenza. We rely on supplemental funding, and I have been with BARDA for almost 16 years through H1N1, multiple Ebola outbreaks, Zika, COVID, obviously, the current outbreak in Uganda, as well as MPOX. And for some of that, we have received supplemental funding, and for other outbreaks, we have not received any money yet. But we work together with our industry partners, the private sector. And so BARDA is more than just a funding agency. We bring our scientific expertise to the table to partner with the company. And this is whether we're investing $100 million with the company or several $100,000 with the company. We form a project coordination team, bring our scientific expertise, manufacturing expertise, regulatory expertise, non-clinical, clinical expertise to truly partner with the company and push their products forward because we want everybody to be successful. Next slide, please. We support all aspects of product development. I know we're going to talk about some of the, talk about innovation and how do we push innovation forward. So BARDA has an innovation ecosystem that we are supporting. We have our Blue Knight program. We have a specific division, the Division of Research, Innovation, and Ventures within BARDA that supports innovative investments on behalf of BARDA. We have our BARDA Ventures program, which is 21st Century Cures Act authority that we were provided and allows us to work with a venture capital investment firm. And we also have our accelerator network, which are 13 accelerators located across the United States to amplify the BARDA signal and also bring innovators to BARDA for discussions. And then we also have the CARB-X program, which many of you are aware of, that we just renewed our commitment to CARB-X for 10 years. And typically what you hear of BARDA doing is advanced research and development, so we obviously do that, as well as support licensure of the products and procurement of those products, either under a vendor-managed inventory system or for disposition into the Strategic National Stockpile. Next slide, please. So over our history, we have supported 65 FDA approvals, licensures, or clearances of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and devices that cut across CBRN, pandemic influenza, and emerging infectious diseases. So I think there are the funds that we were provided by Congress. I think you're seeing a return on investment of those funds. These products are available and better protect the U.S. population in the event that they are needed. And as Dimitri said, so the Jynneos vaccine, which is licensed not only for smallpox, but for Mpox, was utilized immediately during the Mpox response. Next slide, please. And I mentioned, we receive our annual appropriations, and we receive about $2 billion each and every fiscal year, and that sounds like a lot of money. But if you look at the number of material threat determinations that we have to address, and material threat determinations are the specific pathogens or the agents that we need to develop medical countermeasures against. There's 21 of those for CBRN, and then we also have pandemic influenza as well. You can see that money doesn't go quite as far. But if you look at how much we've invested in partnership with our DoD colleagues in the past 2.5 years is $80 billion that has been provided to BARDA that we worked with our DoD colleagues to invest in. We've invested in over 105 specific products, 146 partnerships. Many of you are aware the almost 1 billion doses of vaccine that have been delivered. This is inclusive of the bivalent vaccine. Over 18 million therapeutics have been delivered, and over 286 million diagnostics that were supported by BARDA. And these funds have also supported 3 FDA approvals. One of the very first COVID diagnostics was supported by BARDA that is now cleared by the FDA. So you can see, my argument would be that we need additional funding to prepare for pandemics as opposed to being provided, and we appreciate all of the supplemental funding that we are provided by Congress, but we need those funds earlier so that we can prepare, as our panelists have mentioned already. You need to be doing this stuff now in order to prepare for the next pandemic. And the next slide, please. So what are we doing? You've heard about the National Biodefense Strategy and Implementation Plan and the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan. And so BARDA is going to play a key role as we move forward. We have laid out our strategy, and we worked across the Department of Health and Human Services. All the agencies worked together to lay out their strategy, so there was a coordinated effort that was put forward in the budget request. It is yet to be funded, but we are still hopeful that we may see funding in the fiscal year 24, if not sooner. But the goal is to develop prototype vaccines for specific virus within a family member, therapeutics inclusive of antivirals, as well as diagnostics. Not only do we have to support the phase 1 and the phase 2 clinical studies, but we have to support commercial scale manufacturing of those. As quickly as we were able to move under the COVID response, manufacturing was still the highest risk and the longest pole in the tent for getting those vaccines available to the U.S. population. So we have to do all of the clinical trials, inclusive of potentially being able to license those vaccines, and many of those trials are going to have to be global trials because many of the pathogens are not present here in the United States, so we're going to be dependent on our global partners to work together to actually support those clinical trials. But again, it's the commercial scale manufacturing and validation of that manufacturing process so that if something does happen and you are able to use that technology that supported the licensure of the vaccine in that virus family member, is to do what we've done with a bivalent vaccine and just put in a different antigen and then manufacture at scale because you've already worked out all of the manufacturing issues. Next slide, please. And this aligns well with our BARDA strategic plan. So we have a very bold vision of what we want to do as we move forward. And the next slide, please. And under the American Pandemic Preparedness Plan and the National Biodefense Strategy, everybody's heard of the 100-day plan. It is a very ambitious goal. If you ignore the 2 timelines on the very left-hand slide, if you look at what we were able to do under the COVID response, where you had a whole of government effort working together with our private sector partners, it took 5 months to repurpose a therapeutic that was already in development for phase 3 clinical trials. It took 10 months for us to develop and get EUA approval for our first monoclonal antibodies. It took 11 months for the vaccines and 24 months for antivirals to achieve emergency use authorization. So for the vaccines and the monoclonals, I mean, obviously, everybody was very proud of what was accomplished, and it was, an incredible effort, but that is not going to meet the 100-day goal. But we have shown that we can do this. So if you look on the very left-hand side, For an Ebola response, we now have licensed vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. So those are available 24 hours after an outbreak is determined, and we can ship those immediately. I apologize, I used the term monkeypox. I should have updated this. It escaped me. But for Mpox, we also had a licensed vaccine that we were able to ship out in 24 hours. And then if you look at what we were able to do in partnership with our industry partners under the bivalent COVID vaccine, we were able to go from the FDA determination of what components would be in the vaccine to having tens of millions of doses of vaccine available within 62 days. So we can do it, but again, it's based on having licensed vaccines, therapeutics, licensed technologies that can be quickly pivoted to address those outbreaks. So it is possible, but we have to start working together now to do all of this work so that for the next pandemic, we are much better prepared than we were for COVID-19. And I think that's the last slide. This is just if you want to get in contact with BARDA, if you want to see the investments we've made on medicalcountermeasures.gov, we have a Drive website, and you can also see our solicitations on sam.gov. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you for those presentations. It's probably not shocking that we have 3 government representatives, and we have 3 presentations that I think present a optimistic, rosy, I'm not exactly sure how I would put it, but a positive spin. I have to say I'm a little more skeptical myself about our response, and more importantly, our ability to respond in the next pandemic. And I want to raise a few issues about the development of countermeasures, and in particular, the development, the clinical research enterprise that is going to be absolutely essential to no matter what we do, no matter how much money we have. I don't think this is fundamentally, certainly during COVID, fundamentally a money problem. I do think as Naheed said, the pause, the post-pandemic response, and the sort of trying to build up and address structures has been poor. It always is poor in the United States. We tend to want to forget rather than to build stronger. But let me make, I think, 4 or 5 points that go to the heart of what I think is our Achilles heel in terms of developing new things. The first, I want to emphasize that we depend upon researchers to get a lot of this done, especially in the clinical research space. You have to have clinical researchers leading studies. And one of our big problems, in my humble opinion, is that the interest of researchers and research institutions, the academic health centers, are not coincident with the interests of the nation during a pandemic. Researchers and research institutions' interests are to gain prestige, gain fame, and gain recognition for their work and get money. That may not be equivalent or work well with the need to have coordination and collaboration. I don't get recognition if I'm part of a big group. And we know that you're not going to get the research breakthroughs we need for pandemic preparedness one-on-one. And so the collaboration we need in any of these responses is going to have to be encouraged. I would use the word coerced, but I'll use the word encouraged. People will not do it voluntarily. So, and that's important to keep in mind, because you can structure the best program, but if you can't get the private community out there to collaborate, it isn't going anywhere. And we have seen that problem, most notably in the convalescent plasma fiasco, in my opinion, where we had scores, if not hundreds or thousands of tests of convalescent plasma, all done differently, none coordinated, and no major coordinated effort. This goes to a second issue, and that is the priorities during a pandemic, and establishing them clearly, and getting priorities that we need accomplished in terms of things like oral antivirals during the COVID pandemic. They were actually down the list. Monoclonals were up the list, even though there was very good reason to think that the monoclonals were not necessarily going to be our best approach because of evolution of the virus. Establishing those priorities clearly, getting all the research community to buy into them, as well as the production community, because research has to be combined with development and manufacturing, as I think was very well pointed out. Getting everyone on the same page and making sure that we establish clear priorities very quickly and pivot quickly, in getting everyone to play by the same hymnal is going to be, I think, critically important. I don't think we have that mechanism in place yet. And I don't think when priorities are established, everyone will necessarily participate. I will raise a third point, which is a lot of and I think this was emphasized, I think Gary made this point clearly. I think this is very, very important. A lot of the funding we have, certainly to the CDC, obviously to BARDA, is categorical and has some very, very severe limits on flexibility when an emergency happens. And this is not optimal for planning and not optimal for flexibility. I do think this is an important lesson. We need to trust our civil servants in this regard, and the expertise of the civil servants, and be less directive about the dollars should go to this, this, and this, and be able to pivot. One of the things we know in the venture field and early startup development is no startup company completes its business plan without multiple pivots. I think I saw the statistic from one of my colleagues at Wharton that every startup, the average number of pivots of a startup are 3 to 4 before they hit the right answer. So that means that you have to have flexibility. And I think the categorical funding approach we have is not conducive to the flexibility we need, especially in responding to a fast-moving pandemic. And you can't rely on legislation, et cetera. So we need to do that. The fourth thing I would mention is our being the United States has a very poor approach, in my humble opinion, to clinical research and how we do trial design. Naheed mentioned recovery. Recovery was able to be so successful, I don't think just because they have a national health service and they don't have a private healthcare system. I think one of the reasons they're more successful is the British have a culture, thanks to Pedo and others, of large, simple, randomized trials. And we do not have that culture. We have avoided that large, simple, randomized trials. We have trials with very specific inclusion criteria that are very narrow, and we have continued to do that. And I think that hampers our ability to get trials up and running and to get them fast and to have a wide aperture open. I think having better clinical trial design that are simple with simple inclusion criteria, aiming for large is much better approach. And I think that's something we can take from the British recovery approaches. One of the other elements that distinguishes us from Britain and allowed them to get going faster and do better is contracting. In all levels, not just to researchers, but to all state and local governments. The U.S. government is distributing a lot of the money for whether it's public health monitoring or to institutions to conduct research. And Naheed mentioned, we have this federal system, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is true. But let's remember, most of the money comes from the U.S. federal government and Washington, D.C. And putting requirements on people to participate in these research studies, to agree to the priorities, to provide data, we could use our contracting mechanism much better. One of the slowest points in getting clinical trials up and running is not the design necessarily, not the IRB review, which has often been blamed for slowing things down, but it turns out contracting is the slow man. And it's true in lots of places. One solution that recovery has used quite successfully is, here's the contract, it's take it or leave it. It's not your lawyers are going to, do every change that they want. That we are distributing the money, here's the contract, you take it or you leave it. And by the way, we will notice if you leave it on your subsequent other contracts. It seems to me when we're distributing the billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars we're distributing, having take it or leave it contracts that don't take a lot of negotiation facilitates people, facilitates the ability to do the clinical work and the other work we need in rapid time during a pandemic. That is not a mechanism we have used. And finally, I think we have a very old-fashioned recruitment mentality where we're going to go to academic centers and they're going to go to their networks. We have not maximally used our creativity in terms of recruiting people for clinical trials. And I think that has been to our detriment. We have networks, we use some of the networks, but let's remember there were and are a lot of people who, if given the opportunity, not by academic health centers, but just called up from their test results, would have enrolled in many trials at many points. We did not use such mechanisms, and it seems to me we need to rethink how we recruit. All of this, I think, is relevant for pandemic preparedness and the clinical research necessary to confirm therapeutics, test therapeutics and vaccines. It's also necessary in the post-pandemic, like now in our long COVID research that is absolutely essential to understand what's gone before and what is the legacy of our pandemics. And I think taking a different approach, there's nothing that suggests to me we have learned from the pandemic to take a different approach when it comes to what we have done in our long COVID response. So with that, I would first like to give the panelists an opportunity to respond to me or to respond to each other, if you would like to take that, or we can go to questions. Naheed, would you like to take an opportunity to respond to anything you heard, and not just from me, but
now I'm just scared, Zeke. I don't know. I wanted to point out one. I know we're focusing on clinical trials, but I want to take the opportunity to say that there is a very unique role of the government in terms of research, which even precedes, randomized control trials, which is to do those things that market forces alone and research alone, independent researchers alone would not be able to accomplish, right? This is a critical role and a big part of this currently right now, for example, and your point about we should really have we learned something. I think that the big part of this is, for example, the push that we're making, the Biden administration is currently making to try to, put down some sort of investment on next generation COVID, pan-corona, sarbecovirus tools, whether they're vaccines and treatments, right? That is an example. Mucosal vaccines that potentially can protect us from the next beta coronavirus that makes an impact. Those are the kind of gee whiz big investments that only government can do, that can accelerate the timeline. And I think, Gary, the work that Operation Warp Speed did was based on the initial work that had been done from government investment beforehand. And that's an important part that I think that we need to stress in terms of what it does and identify that it does very successfully. The other thing that it does, and Gary, you stressed this, I think, is another role that it's beyond beyond the clinical trials themselves, which I think was done well, and I think we need to continue to invest in this, which is taking a broader sector-wide view to R&D. So not just investing in the research itself, but the components of research, the raw materials, the supply chains for being able to do it in a moment of crisis, to look at the entire sector and to be able to support that during a crisis and beforehand. And the third thing that I think that government can do, the U.S. government and others can do, that I think potentially academic institutions and industry don't have that broader perspective, is supporting a global partnership and commitment from multiple multilateral partners. And the 100-day mission is a good example of that, is creating that vision, that investment across borders to be able to do this. And we're doing that not just, I think, through the 100-day mission, but also the work that we can do by investing in the pandemic fund, which the Biden administration's invested in, but ensuring that capacity, that research capacity exists in many different places, aside from just within our borders as well, which is necessary and critical. I don't know if you have something to add.
Sure. So I really appreciate the perspectives. I mean, agree with a lot of your points. I think there were some things that were done well during the COVID response, and we need to leverage those and build off of those. And there are things that we could do much better as we move forward. My biggest concern moving forward, you mentioned this briefly, is sustainment. Sustainment of anything that we have developed as far as infrastructure through the active clinical trial networks or the ACT network, the investments that we're making in domestic supply chains so that we can manufacture at a population scale a vaccine in 100 days, is to be able to sustain that, in between pandemics. And that is one of my biggest concerns, so that we don't find ourselves back to where we were in December of 2019 when the next pandemic hits. And for the clinical trials, I think there are things that we could do which are much better. I appreciate your perspective on contracting. I've worked in the federal government for almost 16 years, and the FAR, which is the Federal Acquisition Regulations, is a book that's thicker than a Bible. And it just, so there are a lot of complications. I wish there were ways that we could address that. I'm not sure it's going to be done in the immediate future. But within BARDA, we're always looking at ways that we can streamline the funding process. We have our EASY BAA, which is a mechanism for which we can provide funding. Companies provide a 2,000 word abstract. We make a decision on if we're interested or not, and we've made awards in as short as 9 days, most of them occurring in 30 days. We're also streamlining our process for acquisitions. Again, this is primarily for development of products, not specifically for clinical trial research, because we have to have a mechanism that is responsive during a response. So we have what's called a broad agency announcement. It is it has suited BARDA well for preparedness, but it did not work for response. And that is why we also had to partner with our colleagues at DoD. They have 180,000 acquisition experts We have about 50 within the BARDA organization, and so we were able to leverage that. But they have what's called a Medical Countermeasure Consortium, MCDC, which is a group of over 500 companies that belong to this consortium, so that they can leverage those partners immediately upon response. BARDA is looking at establishing our own consortium because we're not always going to be able to rely on our partners at DoD for a future response. We appreciate everything that we've done, that they have done with us, but we're not going to be able to rely on that moving forward. And there are several other things that we're looking at to streamline the process to get funds to companies quicker. BARDA Ventures is a way that we're doing that, again, through our Easy BAA, and then other methods that we are looking to streamline the process. So I'll stop there. I'll let Dimitri jump in. But again, I think there were things that we did well in the COVID response. There are definitely lessons that were learned. We at BARDA are looking at those and really trying to provide solutions as we move forward, so that we don't find ourselves in this situation for the next pandemic. Thanks.
Thanks, Gary. I'll just jump in with a couple of other ideas. Well, in terms of clinical studies, I think that some of the pivotal work happening for Mpox really has to do with therapeutics, as well as some clinical studies that are looking into immune correlates using the Jynneos vaccine using different dosing strategies. So I think there's some good lessons. I think coming in terms of a future for responsiveness. So I think, again, leveraging AIDS Clinical Trials Group has been really important, but still not fast enough. So I think we launched a TPOXX study, which is really important. So that's tecovirimat, the drug that's used that is approved for smallpox. And being studied for Mpox, and so launched after the peak of the outbreak was already done. And so really having some issues recruiting that and requiring some novel strategies. But there are novel strategies, actually, Ezekiel, that you're going to like, I think, that come specifically from that need. So they're working on remote consenting. So this is going to be, I think, really important from the perspective of recruitment, where you do have the person who's diagnosed with Mpox, and if they're not at a site that does the study, they can actually go and go through a virtual recruitment pathway to be able to get into the study without actually being present at an ACTG site, which I think is exciting. Again, ideally would have synced closer to the peak of the outbreak, which I think definitely speaks to the need for a sort of more nimble strategy for implementing clinical studies. Vaccine study moved pretty quickly, so that's recruited already. And I think it does raise, however, the importance of some non-clinical trial studies that are really important in outbreak response. And so thinking about real-time behavioral surveys and studies, which I think Nahid already sort of referenced a bit as something that we can do in government really well. Those have been really critical in understanding what we're seeing in populations affected by Mpox, as well as surveillance-based studies that are needed for vaccine effectiveness or vaccine performance. So CDC able to publish some very early vaccine performance data that's been important in helping us keep the interest in vaccination. But then I think imminently there is more coming, and by imminently I mean this week, that will support, again, the role of the Jynneos vaccine in this response for Mpox. So I think it really brings to, from my perspective, like the sort of holistic view of research, and not only the clinical trials pieces, which are so important, but also the other elements that are surveillance-based, whether it's behavioral or pure surveillance, like we are doing for cases, to be able to identify how vaccine is performing. Thank you.
And sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to step in one more time. One thing I was just going to quickly mention, and I'm going to take my government hat off for a second, just to say this. I think the two things that could be critically important, I think another role that, would be, that I think only potentially government can do, which is very early on, there are the same issues with data sharing and sample sharing when a new pathogen appears, right? And this happens in every outbreak that I've been part of. And that relates to, thinking through, I think we could do a better job of thinking through how the federal government could potentially alleviate those early challenges of data sharing, sample sharing. And of course, there's, transporter questions of how we do this with Nagoya and other things, but within the borders. I ran the the biorepository study for my medical institution for COVID-19, a critical component that most people don't recognize, so important at the beginning of infectious diseases outbreaks, because you require clinical samples to be able to test new diagnostics before you can actually even do the clinical trials in some settings, to be able to understand biomarkers, to be able to sort of understand viral loads and other aspects in a disease, right? And those, in this pandemic, many of those biorepositories were set up by individual academic centers and networks. We have biorepositories for cancer, for example. We don't have a similar setup. And so what are the ways to explore? What are the ways that there might be a role for us to play, or, you know, that role in research is being able to exchange that. And related to that are the regulatory components and looking at how those the contracting and the regulatory components should actually share samples between centers who are doing research has been another thing that researchers have quoted as a challenge at the very beginning of pandemics as well. And that might be another place where I think we could take a closer look to do a better job with. Thank you.
Well, I think all of us agree that the government has an indispensable role. That's why we're here. The question is, can the government do a better job than it did during COVID? So I don't think that's the issue. And again, I would just lay out, since the government is the one shoveling the money out the door, the government has a lot of leverage. And the question is, how does it use that leverage to the most efficacious to get the results fast? And I totally agree. We need a holistic view. It's not just clinical research, but you can't get a test therapeutic or a vaccine to production without the clinical research, because you simply won't know whether they work or not. I understand we have 3 people lined up, and that the order is Neil Lewis with a question first. So let's go to you, Neil.
Thank you so much for those comments.
Can't hear. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you all for those comments. They're really helpful to hear. My question is really an equity question. So we saw in COVID, these disparities emerge, and then we try to respond to them. Then the same thing happened with Mpox that we heard from and saw the data on that as well. And this has happened with pretty much every other pandemic before. So my question is, what is the government planning to do moving forward to try and prevent these disparities from emerging as new conditions emerge, rather than always trying to play catch up, given that we know these same sort of social determinants create these conditions over and over again? So, thanks.
So I can start with a couple of specific examples that we're doing at BARDA and fully appreciate.
Can you move closer to the microphone,
Sure.
Gary? I think you keep moving your head away.
Okay.
And it makes it hard to hear.
Sorry about that. So a couple of things that we're doing at BARDA is we're looking at ways that we might be able to decentralize clinical trials. There are many people who can't participate in clinical trials just because of their location. So looking at using telehealth, telemedicine, urgent care facilities, as well as local pharmacy chains as a way to potentially, enroll them in clinical trials, not just during pandemics, but for products that we're developing so that they have equal access to those clinical trials. We also have partnered under our Blue Knight program with a company called Aclinate, which actually engages with the community, the Black community, and is informing people about scientific research and clinical research so that they may be more willing to participate in clinical trials, and generates a roster of individuals from across different regions in the United States where they may want to participate. And I think that's the most important thing, or one of the most important things, for people to see that in a clinical trial that, somebody like me was in that clinical trial, and therefore I may be able to benefit from that product as well.
Yeah, hey, this is
Can
Matt. This is Matt Zahn. So I'm not sure I'm supposed to be giving an answer, but as a local public health person, I'll give a comment on it, which is that for COVID, for monkeypox, as a local public health entity, first thing they say is, how many people have you vaccinated? How many have you gotten to? And then after 2 or 3 months, after they've given it to you, then they start to look back at, and this is the response, not research, but this is the response. Then they start to say, okay, let's look at metrics to see where you've reached. Where have you reached? Well, the people who are easiest to reach, because you want to vaccinate as many people as you possibly can. By definition, very often, the disadvantaged group are not the low-hanging fruit. They're not the entities that are easiest to get vaccine to. And so we're really going to have to change on a local level the metrics and the expectations in a concrete way to try and, if you're going to change that dynamic, because otherwise it will always end up being the same. So, sorry.
I would also, yeah, no, not at all. Very important point. I would also emphasize, certainly on the clinical research side, one of the issues of smaller, very focused trials with lots of conditions on the inclusion criteria is the fact that you often exclude people who are members of various minority groups or rural or other categories. Having large and relatively simple trials, having 10% or 5% of a much larger trial is going to get you a lot of people from minority groups than having 5% of a 1,200 person trial, which unfortunately some of the vaccine trials during COVID, that was their size, especially the pediatric ones. And you're like, there's got to be something a little crazy about that. So expanding trials and simplifying the inclusion criteria would also have an impact, I think, on the on minority populations that we can get to. And therefore also on the uptake in the response that Matt just mentioned. Our next question is that.
Could I just chime in with something really quickly?
Please,
I'm sorry.
absolutely. Sorry.
So just no, you're great. So having done this sort of in local public health in New York City as the COVID incident commander, and sort of seeing this unfold both for acute infections and for chronic infections, I think that one of the stark realities is that this does happen, and it is the expectation that it happens that we should be prepared to deal with on the government perspective, being able to make sure that we start with the desire to create a community-driven response. So I think that that disparity, one of the challenges is that so much of it is baked into the system, and the system is so hard to sort of overcome. With that said, identifying ways to sort of put vaccine, as an example, closer to where people are has been really critical in turning around a bit of what we saw in the outcome of vaccines. So really strategies that are looking at non-traditional venues. And I think that can be also said for study engagement as well. The sort of thinking about not just sort of the routine places, as I think, as you said, like are the normal networks that people recruit from, but rather like where can we touch the community and where can we actually use trusted messengers within the community to move things forward. And so I think in the Mpox response, we have great examples of what happens when you put vaccine closer to people. So for instance, we put vaccine at Atlanta Black Pride at actually venues, not at clinical settings. And we provided about 5,000 vaccines to that event, and 4,200 people were vaccinated. And unlike any other vaccine event, the majority were people of color. It was 50% Black, 70% were people of color. So really making the point that sort of thinking about novel strategies to not just do what we always do, but really identify ways that we can put countermeasures closer to people, and also make sure that we know from the beginning that we're going to need engagement with communities that are always going to be overrepresented in these outbreaks, because it's not a surprise. Looking at chronic infectious diseases like HIV, 70% of new HIV infections are happening in Black and brown people. So there's no surprise that similar things would have happened in Mpox. And so even with the best intention of having that level of engagement, we still have to fight to be able to get to a point of equity as opposed to just equality. Thanks.
Just, Zeke, I want to make a very general comment because this is the right time at the, this phase of the pandemic, not at the very beginning. We need to start to think about this now, which is We need to make space in all our intellectual spaces where we talk about pandemic preparedness to make sure we're including different disciplines as well as different communities in this conversation. Or two, like piggybacking on what Dimitri said, I mean, how will we know how to do this right the next time? How will we know how to decrease the inequity that exists out there? Is what happened during this pandemic, and getting all this, not just different communities, but different perspectives within the system on a table for any of these types of conversations, so that because if you keep asking the same people the same questions, they're going to give you the same solutions for the most part. So that would be one way we could sort of help improve our pandemic response.
Great. Dr. Omer, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. So
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. A couple of things. So thanks for the conversation, etc. And I'm going to say that Dr. Emmanuel summarized a lot of the things around the trial infrastructure. The question is there an appetite to sort of do this systematically, and obviously there's an advantage of having a working scientist in the administration, and multiple working scientists, so you have an insider's perspective as well. But broadly speaking, is there an appetite to really work towards that? And I will point to a couple of things to add to what Dr. Emmanuel said. If their clinical trials are difficult to do within the federal system, there are two specific type of trials that are even more difficult to do. For example, public health trials, so with public health outcomes. So we had this conversation in the morning that in terms of masks, we often talk about that it was a communications challenge, but there was a huge challenge in evidence. There's nothing changed for the last 10, 12 years in terms of the technology of an N95 mask or a KN95 mask or a surgical mask for even longer. But we did, as a country and as a world, half-baked, underpowered, small trials. Similarly, another, often innovation comes from investigator-initiated trials. I'm a big supporter of network-based trials. ACTG, for example, is better than, for example, VTU networks, to be very honest, that are very useful. But I think that some networks within the federal system could have an even higher return on investment. But doing investigator-initiated trials is really hard. As someone that has managed somehow to get federal money for both public health trials and investigator-initiated trials, I can tell you, with only minimal exaggeration, it's like pulling teeth in a tornado while there's an earthquake going on. And that's why if you look at the data, federal data, there's so few of these kinds of things that are there. And so trials for diagnostics, field trials for diagnostics, we don't have a mechanism. Not only that we don't have a mechanism, we don't have a vocabulary in the federal system to actually get that done. And so that's one part. Is there an appetite to get down to specifics, to actually have a look at the full portfolio of trials, the full portfolio of intervention studies? So sometimes it's step-edge designs. Sometimes these are Bayesian trials and all of that stuff. So not everything is a trial, but a lot of things are intervention studies. So that's one question. The other question...
Look, I think I couldn't agree more with your points, because I 100% concur, but we do have other people, sure. And I am told we only have about 10 minutes left. So just ask your most important question.
No, I asked the most important question. So that's fine.
Great.
I'll my time.
So you're looking at me,
yes,
so I'll start.
There is an appetite, but you'll be sick of hearing this from all your government friends. There's always the question of, is there support? Is there congressional support to be able to do something that would change the system, right?
Yeah,
but a lot of this, excuse me, a lot of this is not about congressional stuff. A lot of this is about self-imposed rules by the agencies or self-imposed priorities by the agencies themselves. I mean, it's not as if we don't have congressional funding. A lot of the processes, right, whether we do it for diagnostics, how we organize the clinical trial infrastructure, Congress doesn't get into that. That's been decided by the NIH. Investigator-initiated awards still being the top thing as opposed to something more coordinated.
So I was just going to say, agree with both points. I mean, we have to do better because, you know, so one thing that wasn't mentioned is, you know, for therapeutic trials, there were, you know, the active clinical trials. Very early on, we supported some of the independent companies, and they were able to enroll very quickly. What it hasn't been discussed, and I think Janet Woodcock mentioned this in one of her public statements, there were over 900, we'll call them clinical trials, but they were really evaluating different products that were poorly designed, didn't have efficacy endpoints, and didn't enroll, which led to a lot of confusion because it was essentially an expanded access use of the product, so you couldn't tell was there true benefit or not. Also pulled people away from clinical trials, which may have been, you know, better designed to determine efficacy and provide, you know, valuable data moving forward. So there was a lot going on, but we do have to do better. We have to do better at, you know, making sure that our clinical trials are inclusive and you know, that we have a lot of diversity. We did that for the vaccine trials. I'm not going to say everything was perfect, but for the vaccine trials, many people may not be aware that for the ones that were supported by the federal government, we made each of those companies agree to tenets in the trials to harmonize those clinical trials, and not only harmonize the clinical trial, but also where the assays would be run so that we were comparing as best as we could, you know, the clinical samples in common assays. Because when we do that, if we are able to show efficacy, it doesn't mean anything if people are not taking the vaccine or taking the therapeutic. So we have to do better moving forward.
And Zeke, I'm going to push back on you a little bit. I think it's both as well. And the reason why I think it also is funding related is that if you truly want to create an equitable clinical trials network, and you don't want the same 10 institutions that have a lot of funding lying around and a lot of staff, research staff that are there, you want to involve more medical centers in areas that potentially don't have the same infrastructure. You have to have the ability to create a warm base, ability to have funding to keep people employed in a research infrastructure, ability to have other trials that are going to run in those systems where when you don't have an outbreak, right? So it's ready to go in a coordinated fashion, and everybody can partake in that. And I think that upgrading that probably takes a bit of an investment. So I think it's a little bit of both. We can, and we need to do better in both of those things.
Well, we can have that discussion. Recovery was done on what can only be described as a shoestring. And when we have a $50 billion NIH distributing money, we can, I think, find those kinds of resources. Carla San.
Okay, so thank you so much. That's been really insightful. And so yesterday we had a discussion about the global perspective, and lots of the things that have been said at the domestic level really resonate with what ought to be done at the global level too. But yesterday we also talked about the importance of global equity in vaccine allocation and about high-income countries having why it's important for high-income countries to ensure that low and middle-income countries have timely access to vaccines. And I think we're here to discuss the lessons from COVID-19 for the future, but the future came a little bit too quickly with Mpox. And now it seems that we find ourselves in a situation that is very similar to where we were with COVID in terms of global access to Mpox vaccines. So just to give you a sense of the numbers, PAHO, through its revolving funds that procures vaccines for countries of Latin America and the Caribbean since the 70s, has procured 130,000 doses of Jynneos for the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So it's a very, very tiny amount, but it's all we have, and it's great to have that. Any thoughts about the how to move forward in terms of global equity in vaccine allocation?
Anyone?
I was going to give Dimitri the first take on that.
Sure, I'll start. So I think again, looking at the sort of Mpox outbreak and the need for sort of a global response, like we do have a global team that is working through policy issues around sort of how to best address vaccine from the U.S. perspective across the globe. So I don't really have an answer for you yet, but it's something that's being avidly looked into and discussed. So that's a watch this space, as it were, in terms of the future. I do think that there's, from my experience during the Mpox outbreak, for sure, I think also an importance to really sync with nations to see what their needs are. I think that's the domestic assumption of great need sometimes is not met with what we sort of hear when we talk to countries in terms of possibility of sort of looking at sort of vaccine supply. I think also important in the Mpox space is also the reality that this is a very stigmatized disease. I think though COVID does carry stigma, this one carries specifically different stigma with populations overrepresented that in some environments make it hard for countries to even ask for what they need. So I think really identifying a strategy that allows us to have like open and frank conversations, as well as really identify what need is, as opposed to like a domestic assumption of what need is outside of the U.S. is important. Nahid, I'll give it back to you to see if you have a view.
Thank you. So I think from the COVID side, for the global perspective, right, which is really the biggest portfolio that I carry, this is it's not just about that tail point of how do you finally, when you have all the vaccines, get them to where they need to be. I think looking back, there's been a lot of conversation, as we know, about how we created distributed manufacturing capacity, and that is a development question that requires, as Dimitri said, a starting point has to be what is important to the countries, where this capacity would be created. But beyond that, I think it starts at the very beginning. I think it starts with how can we better support research infrastructure and training, and Fogarty does a great job on the training side. But for many researchers who may want to start out by looking at endemic diseases, priority pathogen diseases that might be more important there than here, that may want to push a clinical trial or get CGMP level product of vaccines and other things to test in a clinical trial, there's a lot of hurdles. One is ensuring that we have a biomedical sector that's a bioeconomy that's healthy, and that requires thinking through. It requires that long conversation of what other endemic diseases, what would such distributed manufacturing sort of also produce. It requires having a market sector that's going to make a commitment to saying, we're going to look at how those vaccines will provide this region. Aside from the COVID vaccines, what other vaccines could be distributed in this region? And Gavi, as you know, just released their plan of how they're thinking about manufacturing, and particularly in the continent of Africa, and sort of increasing that. So I think that it's about the public health response part, but beyond that, I think the important part for us is going to be, now that it looks like we will regularly need to get COVID vaccines, at least with the current generation of COVID vaccines, what does that mean for resource-limited settings where this might become a routine adult vaccine, and how do we integrate that into adult life course vaccination as well? So ongoing issues of equity.
Yeah, and if I could just add really quickly, I think, working together with our global partners, we need to think ahead. I mean, the Jynneos vaccine has been licensed for Mpox since 2019. Nobody purchased it. Then there's a crisis, and everybody wants access to it. So we need to work together, and maybe it is, joint, purchase agreements with different global partners to provide that commercial market to the people who are developing the vaccines. It doesn't have to be, always at the scale that we're looking at for COVID-19, but the commercial scale, there was no real commercial market for the Jynneos vaccine. It was primarily purchased by the U.S. government and a few other governments. But I don't, like I mentioned before, I don't have a requirement for Mpox. My requirement is for smallpox. And so we were happy to be able to make this available, in the United States for Mpox. But again, that was not what we were purchasing the vaccine for. It was for smallpox. So I know money is tight in every country. There are multiple diseases that people are trying to address. But somehow, if the global community could work together to potentially provide, even small procurements, but over a sustained period of time, to those manufacturers, it would provide them with some commercial basis for manufacturing.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. We've already gone a little over time, but the organizers have given us a reprieve. Dr. David Kim.
I'm sorry. Well, thank you very much for a really this interesting discussion. I have one comment and one question, and the comment is over the last couple of days, what I basically learned was that we have three disciplines that we're trying to address as far as planning for the future. One has to do with bench science, another with clinical science, and the third, the implementation science. And and this has been discussed on multiple occasions over the last couple of days, but what I have picked up is that we have a gap between clinical science and implementation science. There's a transition that's needed, which will include effective communication, obviously, and that's nothing new to the audience here. Excuse me. And I really feel like that's an area that we are missing, where we need to make the transition so that the three tenets of good public health practice that Dimitri mentioned, good science. I'm sorry, Dimitri. Good science. Let's see.
Community engagement, political will.
Community engagement and political will. And I might rephrase the political will to committed leadership. And how do we go from clinical science where we have possible solutions to public health or clinical implementation side of things? And I feel like that's an area that we can develop more, learn more, and increase our fund of knowledge. And so the question I have is related to that. On the three secret formulas or secret ingredients to the formula, on the good leadership or committed leadership side of things, from the highest executive office, we talked about you talked about preparing for the future.
We need a question,
right?
Otherwise, they're
preparing
going
for the
to
future.
pull us.
So one of those things is preparing the public for acceptance of these public health actions. Given your hindsight, what can we do now so that we can prepare the public better for possible future epidemics?
Anyone?
Sure, I'll start. And I think one of them really has to do with just making sure that in public health in general, that we really focus on very clear risk communication. And so I think that this is, I think one of it's not at all an abstract notion, but it's that what we know today on Thursday may not be what we know on Sunday, and that needs to be something that is just part of the deal. And so I think that also supports systems that allow us to investigate and do research in a way that as findings come in real time, no one is surprised when it causes a frame shift in what we do from the perspective of guidance. So I think that it's really starting at that sort of at the well from the fundamental part, which is to say, like I'll give the example. In MPOX, we were releasing guidance around behavior modification that was based on no data. We really were looking at best practices, like what we could do. And as data became more clear, we were able to nuance that information even more. And then when vaccine became readily available, even more, we could nuance like what behavioral change should look like as you're awaiting for a vaccine response to occur. So I feel like that we were able to do that because at the very beginning, it wasn't an apologetic, but it was this is what we know today, and we're giving you the best knowledge that we have, but be prepared for a change based on changes and realize that there are investigations happening now, whether they're surveillance or research, that may change what we do. And that was even more important when we launched the intradermal dosing of the vaccine, sort of saying that, we really don't know very much beyond one clinical study about the vaccine. And as I've been speaking, an MMWR early release came out really showing that there's no difference in the subcutaneous and intradermal dosing in real world performance, which I think is very exciting. But again, it starts with just really good risk communication so that people know that all of those things, political will, engagement, and science really can change on a dime, especially if you're dealing with an acute outbreak. Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think when you look at the classic, there have been a couple of quagmires, right, in public health. Like when you look at a global polio eradication initiative, there was a study looking at what were the factors that made the actors that were really successful in trying to make that last mile of trying to get, polio vaccines. One of the big things that came out of that study, and I'm trying to remember, it was like 6-7 years ago, was one of the most successful levers of having communities engage on infectious diseases that is of critical importance in that moment is to also learn what else is important to those communities. And that was played out again during Ebola, when you talk about, the testimonials that came out of the DRC, the 2018 DRC outbreak there. It was, why just Ebola is important. And I think understanding one of the ways we can prepare communities is prepare ourselves to understand what else faces those communities during a crisis. And that's, I think, an important part.
Thank you. Okay, so Dimitri has a really hard stop, I understand, at 2:00. He will turn into a pumpkin.
I'm turning into a pumpkin right now. Thank you for having me.
We're going to let you go.
Thank you.
Fortunately, the conveners at the National Academies have given me a reprieve, and we can go on to Dr. Eva Harris next.
Hi, thank you. So Eva Harris, University of California, Berkeley. So rewinding to that discussion about diagnostics, biorepositories, and since we're being so straight up and honest here, just from the academic centers kind of jumping to the fore in the pandemic, this one, Zika, et cetera. I mean, yes, I totally hear the idea about sample size and power, et cetera. I know you're talking about clinical trials, but we're also talking about essentially diagnostics, et cetera. Unfortunately, it really takes a long time dealing with federal everything, biorepositories. It really takes a long time. And so when we are under a lot of pressure, like people are just sharing existing biorepositories from other things. These are negative controls. We have positive controls. We're and we're able to do a lot really quickly, that would then drive larger trials or what have you, And I feel like that it would be awesome to have either pre-banked or just a way. And now you say, what can we do during the recovery, during peacetime? It would be to make those processes much faster so that, there are ways and you can have, pre-MTAs or whatever in place to be able to move quickly at level and at scale. But as usual, we can I work in Nicaragua. We're always so much faster working abroad than we are in this country, and that's just something we can maybe work on in the meantime.
Can I jump in 2 points? First of all, I want to defend the federal government and government in general. I really bristle when people say, well, the federal government slows us down. I've worked with a lot of institutions and private organizations and private companies, and they have the same bureaucracy. They have the same lawyers who want to review everything 27 times to protect and minimize liability. I don't think the federal government's slower. On the other hand, and I do think this is extremely important, your point about could we create ideal contracts now, ideal releases now that everyone agrees to, that are paradigmatic and we don't have to revise for each person before the crisis, I think that's absolutely an essential element so that the contracts are in place, the material release agreements are in place. I totally agree with you. Why should we wait for the crisis to develop those? And we should have them and have time to vet them. Thank you for that point. And maybe Gary or Naheed would like to comment as well.
Yeah, but I also have a hard stop at 2:00.
Same here.
But I agree with your point, and just think about what is in front of us if we truly want to prepare for, future pandemics, is standardized reagents across the board so that when various companies are evaluating their products, we're all using the same thing as far as, for assays and, even for non-clinical models that are developed so that it's everybody's using the same challenge strain, everybody's using the same dose, everybody's using the same time frame for intervention. All of these things need to be developed now so that we are ready for things moving for potentially the next pandemic. But there's so much that is involved in making sure, and it's not just in the U.S., that's globally. We have to make sure that CEPI is working very hard on standardizing reagents and making standards for many assays. We have to work with them to make sure that we're developing the same thing so that we're not looking at apples and oranges when we're comparing.
Good. All right. Last question from Mark Feinberg. Hello?
Mark said I answered all his questions.
Thank you, Gary.
Is that right? You're
So-
passing, Mark?
So we do have one more question, I believe, for a gentleman on the left side.
Jonathan Sleeman, is that what I hear?
My name is Sheldon Jacobson. I'm a computer science professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. I wanted to make a comment which in many ways puts a little bit of a dour look on the future. And the reason is that there is an illiteracy of data understanding in the population. And in many ways, COVID has exposed that from our education system. And although ideally we would like to be able to educate people of the scientific method, because we all know how dirty it is when we get into it. I tell my graduate students that we do the research backwards, but we report it forwards. But when it's on Twitter and Facebook, it's ugly. And the fact of the matter is we have to think much bigger about the fact that if we're going to engage the entire population, not just the learned people that we are, but the people who don't have the kinds of education and training that we have, especially with respect to data and understanding, we are going to be in this situation again. And we have to think a bit bigger about how we're going to challenge it. So I put this out as a thought.
Well, I think that's an incredibly good point, and especially about the issue of public engagement. Having an educated public that does understand some of the complexities of research, what questions you ask, et cetera, is obviously an important element if you're going to have them participate and help shape the kind of structure and kind of research we do and the kind of products we develop.
I was just going to echo that's an excellent point. And one other supplemental point to that is also literacy on where to attain information, particularly for those who might be the most vulnerable. Those who may not have digital literacy to begin with, who, are, I include myself in this, but I have no idea what half the apps out there are these days. But in the ability of where you capture data is an important part.
All right. I think that is it for this panel. We've gone way over, and I want to thank the organizers for permitting us to continue this very dynamic conversation. Thank you very much to Naheed and Gary and Dimitri in absentia.
And thank you, Zeke. And I'll look at the people on when do we want people to come back? Do we
We're
have a
going to
break
come
or-
back at 2:25.
2:25. Okay.
Thank you, Zeke.